Arizona Territory, 1879, along the White River where it ran down out of the high country onto the White Mountain Apache Reservation. In a winter that came on harder and longer than any the old men could remember, burying the irrigation ditches under snow that did not melt until the fields beneath them had already gone hungry for it. Asa Bannon ran 300 head of cattle on leased grass in the high country above the river, alone except for one hired hand who came and went with the seasons. And he had lived that way for 11 years, ever since a family disagreement back in Missouri had sent him west with nothing but a horse and a settled preference for his own company over anyone else's. He was 39 years old, quiet in the particular way of a man who has trained himself out of needing conversation, and the town below the mountain had long since stopped expecting him to come down for anything but supplies twice a year, and had settled into calling him, half in jest and half in something closer to unease, the Hermit of Baldy Peak. He had a neighbor he had never properly met, a farming family a mile below his own range along the river's east bank. On land, the reservation boundary ran directly through, and he had watched that family, a widow named Elena, her elderly father, and her young daughter, work a stretch of irrigated ground more skillfully than any Anglo rancher he had known in 11 years, coaxing corn and beans and squash out of desert soil through a system of ditches Elena's father had helped dig 15 years before, when the reservation's agricultural program had still meant what it claimed to mean. By the winter of 1879, it had stopped meaning much of anything at all, on account of a man named Rufus Talmadge. Talmadge had held the agency post at Fort Apache for 4 years, and in that time he had learned, the way certain men in that position inevitably learned, that a government contract for beef and flour rations could be filled at half the promised quantity and the difference sold quietly to traders and ranchers willing to pay cash and ask no questions, provided the agent controlling the books was willing to falsify a delivery manifest here and there. Talmadge had proven considerably willing. The families depending on those rations had grown considerably thinner across 4 winters of his tenure, and the winter of 1879, arriving early and hard atop 2 poor harvests, threatened to be the one that finally cost lives rather than merely comfort. Elena's father, a respected man among the White Mountain people who had once scouted for the Army before the reservation boundaries had settled into their present narrower shape, went to the agency in November to ask, plainly, why the promised beef ration had not arrived in 6 weeks, and Talmadge had told him, with the particular smoothness of a practiced liar, that supply wagons were delayed by weather, that patience was required, that the government's promises would be honored in time. They were not honored in time. By the 2nd week of December, Elena's family had exhausted the last of their own stored harvest, thin as it had been after a poor summer, and the elderly and the very young across a dozen families along that stretch of the river had begun to show the particular gauntness that comes before real hunger turns to real danger. Asa Bannon noticed it the way he noticed most things about that land, slowly, from a distance, and then all at once, unable to unsee it. He had ridden down to the river's edge in the 2nd week of December to check a stretch of fence line that marked the boundary of his lease, and he had seen Elena's daughter, a girl of perhaps 7, standing at the edge of the family's field digging in already harvested ground for whatever forgotten root or kernel the earlier picking might have missed, her coat too thin for the cold, and her small hands already reddened from the work of it. He said nothing to the girl. He rode home, and that night, well past midnight, he loaded a sack of flour and a side of bacon and a crate of dried beans onto a pack mule, and he rode down to the family's small adobe house in the dark, and he left the whole of it stacked neatly against their door, and he rode away again before dawn, without knocking, without waiting, without leaving so much as a name. He told himself, riding home in the gray pre-dawn cold, that he had done it because it was simply the decent thing a person did when a child was digging frozen ground for scraps a mile from his own well-stocked larder. He did not examine the feeling much further than that first night. Elena found the supplies at first light, and her first reaction was not gratitude but caution, sharp and immediate, born of 4 winters learning that anything arriving unexplained near a reservation boundary could as easily be a trap as a kindness. Contraband planted to justify an arrest, a bribe meant to compromise her family's standing, or simply the kind of gift that came, eventually, with a price attached that nobody had bothered mentioning up front. She brought the sacks inside anyway, because her daughter was hungry and caution, however wise, did not fill a child's stomach. But she watched the road that night, and the next, from the darkened window of the house, hoping to see whoever had left it. She saw no one. The supplies simply appeared, every 3rd or 4th night through the remainder of December, always before dawn, always without a word, always enough to matter, and never so much as to draw notice from the agency should anyone come asking questions about where a starving family had found the means to keep eating through the hardest weeks of that winter. She began, by the new year, to suspect who it might be. There was only one household within riding distance whose supplies could account for the quality and the quantity of what kept appearing. Good flour, real coffee, once a whole side of smoked bacon that could only have come from a well-run ranch operation, and only one such operation sat within an easy midnight ride of her family's door. She did not confront him. Not yet. She found, instead, that she had begun leaving something of her own at the edge of her field each evening the supplies had come the night before, not a note, since she did not know for certain whether the mountain man could read English, or whether she ought to risk writing anything at all that might be found by the wrong eyes, but a small woven basket, set out plainly on the fence post nearest the road, empty, waiting. Asa found the basket on his 3rd delivery of January, sitting on the fence post exactly where he would have to pass to reach the house, and he understood immediately that its presence there was neither accident nor coincidence. It was an answer. It was Elena telling him, without a single word exchanged between them, that she knew, and that she was not asking him to stop. He began using the basket after that, filling it and leaving it hung back on the same post rather than stacking sacks against the door itself, and Elena began, in turn, leaving it stocked with something small in return on the nights he was not expected. A handful of dried chiles from her own stores, once a small woven cloth dyed in a pattern her mother had taught her, gestures that said, as plainly as either of them dared to say anything yet, that this had stopped being one person's charity, and had become, slowly, an exchange between 2 people who had not yet found the courage to speak it aloud. It was the last week of January when Elena finally caught him. She had woken before dawn with her daughter feverish beside her, a chest cold that had settled hard enough to worry her, and she had gone to the window meaning only to check the weather, before deciding whether the ride to the agency doctor was worth risking in the cold, and she saw, in the gray pre-dawn light, a rider dismounting at the fence post, setting the basket down with the particular careful quiet of a man who had done this many times before, and did not intend to be noticed doing it now either. She went out to him before he could remount. "Mr. Bannon," she said, and watched him go very still at the sound of his own name spoken by a woman he had never once properly introduced himself to. He turned. In the gray light, she could see his face clearly for the first time at this close a distance. Weathered, careful, the face of a man who had spent 11 years training himself not to expect conversation, and did not entirely know what to do now that one had arrived. "You know my name," he said finally. "The whole valley knows your name, Mr. Bannon. What the valley does not know is that its hermit has been keeping a dozen families from starving this winter, one basket at a time, without once asking a word of thanks for it. I did not do it for thanks. I know that," Alana said. "That is precisely why I have not stopped you before now. A gift given for thanks is a transaction, Mr. Bannon, and I have had my fill of transactions with men who wanted something in return, whether they said so plainly or not. A gift given for nothing at all is a different matter entirely, and I find I have been waiting some while to meet the man capable of giving one." Asa Bannon stood in the cold, with the empty basket still in his hands, and found himself, for the first time in 11 years of careful solitude, entirely at a loss for the words he generally did not need. "My daughter is sick," Elena said, before the silence could stretch too long. "A chest cold. Bad enough I am considering the ride to the agency doctor despite the weather. I do not suppose a man who has spent 2 months learning our fence post so well has also learned anything of doctoring." "Some," Asa admitted. "Enough to know whether a fever is dangerous or only miserable. I would be glad to look at her, if you would allow it." Elena studied him a long moment, weighing this new question the same careful way she had weighed every gift left on that fence post through 2 months of silence. And then she stood aside from her own doorway and let him in. The girl's fever, Asa judged, was miserable rather than dangerous, and he said so, and stayed long enough to help build the fire higher and to steep a tea from dried herbs Elena's father directed him toward from a store the old man kept for exactly this purpose, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, Asa Bannon had spent the better part of 2 hours inside a house he had spent 2 months visiting only in the dark, speaking more words aloud than he generally spoke in a full week of his own solitary company. "You did not have to stay," Alana said, walking him back out to his horse once the girl had settled into an easier sleep. "I know," Asa said. "I stayed anyway." It became, from that morning forward, a different kind of arrangement between them, no longer wordless, though no less careful. Asa riding down in daylight now, openly, to check on the girl's recovery, and then, once she had recovered, simply to sit a while on the porch with Elena and her father, learning the particular rhythm of a household he had spent 2 months feeding without once, understanding what its days actually looked like. Ilana's father, a man named Nahilze, who had scouted 11 years for an army that had, in his own quiet estimation, repaid that service with considerably less honor than it had promised, took a slow and careful liking to the mountain man who had kept his family fed through the hardest winter in a decade without once seeking credit for it. "You are the first Anglo in this valley," Nahilze told him one February evening, "who has given something to my family and not eventually asked for something larger in return. I have known traders who gave credit at the store and collected it back tenfold in labor. I have known agents who gave rations and collected obedience. I had begun to believe every gift in this territory carried a hidden invoice. I did not intend mine to," Asa said. "I do not know that I can promise you it never will. Only that I have not thought of a single thing I want from your family that your family has not already, freely, given me back tenfold, in the daughter's company, and the father's conversation, and considerably better cooking than I have managed alone in 11 years. Nahilse laughed at that, a real laugh, and it was the first time Asa had heard the sound in the 2 months he had known this family existed. Elena, watching the two men from the doorway, found herself smiling in a way she had not allowed herself in the 4 hard years since her husband's death. A scouting accident on a mountain trail 2 winters before the rations had begun their slow starvation of the whole valley. By March, Asa Bannon had become, without either of them formally announcing it to anyone, a fixture of Elena's household nearly as steady as her own father, and the courtship that had begun as a wordless exchange of baskets had grown slowly and carefully into something both of them had begun, privately, to hope might last considerably longer than 1 hard winter. Rufus Talmadge, meanwhile, had a considerably harder winter of his own developing, though he did not yet know its full extent. The complaints against him had grown loud enough, by February, that the regional superintendent's office in Prescott had finally dispatched an inspector to review the agency's ration books against the actual delivery manifests. A routine audit Talmadge had successfully avoided for 3 years through a combination of forged paperwork and a friendly relationship with the fort's previous commander. The previous commander had rotated out the past autumn. The new one, a Colonel Whitfield newly arrived from an eastern posting, had no particular loyalty to Talmadge and had begun asking, on his own initiative, uncomfortable questions about a reservation population that seemed, by his own observation on his rounds, considerably thinner and hungrier than the agency's official reports described. Talmadge learned of the coming inspection in the 2nd week of March, and he learned at nearly the same time that Nahilze had been gathering statements from a dozen families willing to testify, plainly, about the missing rations and the deliveries that had never arrived, testimony that would align, damningly, against whatever falsified manifest Talmadge produced for the inspector's review. He came to the agency office that week to confront Nahilze directly, summoning him under the pretext of routine business, and found Asa Bannon present as well, having ridden down that same morning to accompany the old man, a precaution neither of them had discussed aloud, but both had understood was wise given how these confrontations had a way of turning. "I understand," Talmadge said, "that you have been telling stories to anyone willing to listen about missing beef and flour that never existed to begin with. I would remind you, Nahilze, that this agency controls a great deal more about your family's circumstances than a few sacks of flour. Passes off the reservation. Access to the school. The good graces of a government that has been, by any fair measure, considerably more patient with your people than certain other territories have managed. You are threatening a man for telling the truth," Asa said, in front of witnesses, "which strikes me as a fairly poor strategy for a man who ought to be worried about an inspector arriving inside the week." Talmadge's composure slipped, briefly, into something considerably less smooth. "This is not your business, Bannon. You are not a resident of this reservation, and your opinion carries no legal weight in agency affairs. My opinion doesn't need legal weight. My eyewitness account of what your rations actually looked like this winter does, and I intend to give the inspector a very thorough one, alongside every basket I filled myself because your office failed to fill its own." Asa's voice had not risen, but every word of it landed with the particular weight of a man who had spent 11 years choosing his words carefully, because he so rarely spent them at all. "You have got 1 week left to decide whether you want to spend it threatening families or covering your own tracks. I would spend it wisely, if I were you." Talmadge did not spend it wisely. He spent it, instead, attempting to destroy the evidence of 4 years of theft, the true delivery manifests he had kept hidden out of some misguided sense of self-protection in a locked cabinet in the agency storehouse, alongside the surplus rations still awaiting sale to the trader who had been buying his stolen goods across those same 4 years. He set the storehouse fire himself on the night before the inspector's scheduled arrival, intending it to look like an accident of a poorly banked stove, and he did not account in his planning for the fact that the storehouse sat close enough to the agency's own supply of remaining winter rations, and close enough besides to a row of small houses where several families, Elena's included, had come that evening to help finish preparing statements for the inspector's visit. The fire spread faster than Talmadge had planned for, catching the dry timber of the storehouse roof and throwing sparks across a wind-driven gap toward the nearest house, where Alana's daughter and 3 other children had been left sleeping while their parents worked late by lamplight on the gathered testimony. Asa smelled the smoke before anyone else did, riding in late from his own ranch to collect Elena and Nahilse for the walk home, and he was off his horse and shouting the alarm before the flames had fully caught the second roof. He got the children out first, working with Nahilse and 2 other men to pass them hand to hand through a window already thick with smoke, and it was Elena, arriving at a dead run from the meeting house where the statements were being gathered, who understood, faster than any of the men working the immediate fire, that the wind carrying sparks toward the houses was also carrying them directly back toward the storehouse's remaining stock. The whole winter's worth of surplus rations Talmadge had stolen and never sold, still sitting in that burning building, the very proof that would have condemned him beyond any doubt. The manifests, she said, the real ones, they are in that cabinet, and if that building burns to the ground, we lose the only proof that survives him. She went in herself, before anyone could stop her, wrapping a wet blanket around her head and shoulders, and moving through smoke thick enough to blind a person within 3 steps, guided only by her own certain memory of the storehouse's layout from years of collecting her family's rations there, before Talmadge's theft had made those visits increasingly rare and increasingly disappointing. She found the cabinet. She broke its lock with a fence post iron she had grabbed on her way through the yard, and she pulled the ledger free, just as the roof beam above her groaned with the particular sound of timber about to give, and she was 3 steps from the door when it did give, coming down behind her close enough that the heat of it singed the edge of her shawl. Asa caught her as she came stumbling out, ledger clutched against her chest, coughing smoke from lungs that would ache for days afterward, and he held her upright while the storehouse finished collapsing behind them both, the surplus rations and every trace of easy proof burning with it. Everything, that is, except the ledger Elana had carried out with her own 2 hands. "You did not have to go in there," he said, when he could speak past his own fear for her. "I know," Elana said, still coughing, still holding the ledger fast against her chest. "I did it anyway. Rufus Talmadge was arrested within the week, the inspector's own investigation confirming everything the surviving ledger recorded and everything a dozen families' sworn testimony had already made plain, and he was removed from his post and tried, eventually, before a federal court in Prescott, where the evidence of 4 years' systematic theft from a starving population proved considerably harder to explain away than a poorly banked stove. Colonel Whitfield, taking a considerably more direct interest in the agency's affairs than his predecessor ever had, oversaw a full winter's back rations finally delivered to the families Talmadge had cheated, and the trader who had been buying the stolen goods lost his own license to operate near the reservation, a quieter but no less real consequence of that same investigation. The valley's harvest came in strong that autumn, the irrigation ditches finally running full and unimpeded, and Asa Bannon and Elana were married that October, in a ceremony held on the same stretch of ground where a fence post had once carried a basket back and forth between 2 people too careful, at first, to say aloud what they meant by it. The basket itself, worn now with 2 years of use, hung afterward inside their home rather than on the fence post that had first carried it, filled, each autumn from then on, with the first corn of the family's harvest, set on the table at the center of every gathering, a small, quiet reminder of exactly how the family had begun, not with a knock at a door, not with a word spoken aloud, but with a gift left in the dark by a man who had asked for nothing in return, and a woman who had answered him, in her own time, with a gift of her own. Some kindnesses announce themselves loudly, wanting to be seen and thanked and remembered. Others arrive in the dark, before dawn, asking nothing, expecting nothing, content simply to have been useful to a family that needed it, and it is very often those quiet kindnesses, given with no thought of return, that end up building the truest and most lasting things a life can hold. She never asked. That was exactly why he kept coming back, night after night, until the coming back itself became the whole of what neither of them had yet found words for, and then, at last, the words came too, and stayed. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and took the long road and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out along the White River in Arizona Territory, where the irrigation ditches still run the same course they ran a century and more ago, the love between Asa Bannon and Elena became the kind that started in silence and grew, slowly and honestly, into a whole life spoken plainly, at last, out loud. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail,